Some would say, though, Matthew, that Western societies have struggled with productivity for an awfully long time now. And to blame this on migration or immigrants is really to ignore the fact that they are a way to grow our economies, that they do bring savings and economic activity and a willingness to often do jobs and work that longer standing citizens either refuse or are unable or unwilling to do. So talk to us a bit about productivity. I think people want to hear more as to why you think migration is a solution to this, when others would see migration and immigration as a pretty important economic force in 20th century society.
Let me start with a story. I have a car wash around the corner from where we live in Hertfordshire, and the car wash used to be automated. So you'd drive your car in, you wouldn't see anybody, you'd go in, you'd buy a token, you'd put it in, you'd have your car washed. Now we have a manual car wash with 5 or 6 people working there, most of them from Albania. I don't know if they're legal, I don't know if they're illegal, but the car wash is now dependent upon what is presumably cheap labor. That is a microcosm of the broader issue that is playing out within Western societies, including, by the way, Canada and also Sweden. Canada and Sweden are both fascinating to me because I used to live in Canada. I went to Western. And in Canada and Sweden, 20 years ago, you really wouldn't find anybody who was critical of the economics of mass migration. I mean, they were notoriously liberal, tolerant, progressive societies. I was in Sweden a month ago. I couldn't find a single expert academic that I was talking to that was suggesting mass migration had been an unalloyed positive for Swedish society. Now, most of that, in fairness, was about cohesion, crime and security, not about the economics. But I think even in Canada, Justin Trudeau and others have pointed to this issue of a population trap, whereby you're basically using large-scale migration to try and prop up a consumption economy that's no longer providing basic public services. Now, people on the left, like Ash and others, used to care about that. They used to say, actually, what we really care about, good public services and treating people with fairness and equality. But what's happened is, for the left, pro-migration has become a sacred value. It's become like a religion. So you can't question it at all. And if you do, you're presented with a very sort of simplistic, quite extreme interpretation, like the one you just heard. Whereas, if you're critiquing migration, you're suggesting that, well, migration should just come down and you're not bothered about anything else. I don't know anybody who's making that argument. What we're saying is, to be clear, the current model of mass immigration is bad for national economies in the West because it is suppressing productivity, GDP per capita, and is allowing big business to get away with relying on cheap workers rather than innovating their business practices. In the UK, GDP per capita has been going backwards. It's the weakest since the 1970s. Now, this is not what economists told us. In the 1990s, the economists told us trade liberalization and globalization would increase GDP and GDP per capita. They told us it would make our economies more productive and it would lift all boats. Tony Blair in 2005 said if you didn't believe that, basically you were a closed-minded idiot. That was his speech at Labour conference. They were all wrong. I mean, the economists are now, with the exception of the more extreme ones, coming to the view that this is not a good economic model. The only people who basically won't accept that are the economists who are either invested in promoting globalization to begin with, or people on the left who now view pro-immigration as a kind of new religion that cannot be questioned at all. What we need to do, I think, to boost productivity is stop allowing companies to get away with relying on cheap labor, with projecting their sort of luxury beliefs. It's not big business that's going to pay the costs of mass migration. It's going to be ordinary people in northern England and elsewhere. And we need to get back to, I think, building an economy that is much more selective in how it uses migration. And where Ash and I would depart is, I would argue, an economy that is embedded around a principle of national preference, which is that public services and the economy need to be built around ensuring that British workers, British families, British people are put above the interests of big business and corporate lobbies. And that's really where I think we depart. And just lastly, I would just say, London, I've lived in London, in and around London my whole life. I'm 42. London is not Britain, and London is certainly not England. There are lots of areas outside of London that really do not exhibit the kinds of success stories, if that's what Tottenham is, that you can see in London. I would argue that the kind of integration and cohesion that you have in big capital cities is not always high trust cohesion. It's a transitory, fluid cohesion, often built around communities that are very fast paced and transitory. I think the real test is what you're seeing outside of capital cities, small, medium towns, and also overall levels of trust. In the UK, trust in institutions has never been as low as it is today. We're not a high trust society anymore. Now, immigration isn't the only reason for that, but I think is a really big reason for that. Lots of people no longer trusting their institutions. And of course, this is largely what Putnam suggested in 2011 when he was widely criticised by the academic community for suggesting that mass migration erodes trust. But that is actually what we're seeing now in the UK.
So, Ash, I'm going to give you an opportunity to weigh in on the kind of economic frame here of this debate. But just to address, if you can, your answer, one question, which I think people, again, listening would have on their minds, is the idea that wage growth in the UK, Canada, elsewhere for working class, blue collar workers has been abysmal over the last decade. And how can we address that in an era of increased immigration and migration, which just demonstrably seems to push down wages because you're adding more people in this most recent tranche, increasingly unskilled, lower educated migrants and immigrants? How does that help the very types of workers that, you know, many the Labour Party of Great Britain arguably is there to support and help, or the New Democratic Party here in Canada? It, I guess, would just seem a bit contradictory to some people to try to understand why the so-called left, the political left, supports high rates of immigration and migration, and how they square that with their agenda to support workers and living wages for workers when you're simply adding supply to a market. And when you add supply, you lower demand.
Okay, well, this is an example where I think we're bashing the one piano key again. Yes, in certain sectors of the economy, migration has had an impact in depressing wages. I think that that's inarguable. However, there are other ways of dealing with that, and I think other factors which have had a much more severe impact on flatlining wages. One is the decimation of the trade union movement and the deliberate curtailing of collective bargaining rights. So in this country, we make it basically impossible for a trade union to organize workers and say, okay, this pay deal that we've secured, it's not just going to apply to this one atomized workplace, it's going to be for the whole sector, right? For me, progress doesn't look like saying, okay, well, these really, really hyper precarious jobs, they're going to be for Brits only, right? They're going to be for Brits only. And when you have income thresholds saying, okay, you've got to earn more than, you know, £38,000 or whatever it is to be able to come here to this country, really what we're saying is, okay, those shit paid jobs, that's good. Those are going to be for Brits, right? I don't think that looks like progress. I think that the way you deal with that isn't by fiddling around with immigration policy. I think the way you deal with that is by strengthening workers' rights, and in particular, collective bargaining. I wanted to, I think, come back to a point about corporate power. The reason why I think we've seen just the decline of nearly everything, right? The decline of quality in your public services, the decline in quality of your housing, the decline in the availability of affordable housing. It's because what neoliberalism has done, and globalization is, of course, a part of it. Migration does fit into it, but I think it's actually a relatively small part. What neoliberalism has done is create these huge parasitic sectors of the economy where their only job is to suck the money out of everything. And I think that reducing immigration doesn't even touch the sides of those sectors. And actually, if what we wanted to do was strengthen the position of the working class in this country, whether it's the British-born working class or the foreign-born working class, the descendants of migrants, white British people. It's about strengthening the hand of labour versus capital. It's not by making the position of migrants even more precarious, by tying them to things like temporary working visas, which just makes them more exploitable.
Excellent. We've touched on, I think, some of the key economic features and facets of this debate in those two answers, so I really appreciate it.